Okay, welcome to the third lecture of Unit 2. You guys will be happy to hear that I have gotten a microphone, so hopefully my voice will be a little easier to understand from now on. In this lecture, we will cover the basics of linguistic anthropology, including historical linguistics, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and the idea of linguistic relativity, and finally Noam Chomsky's ideas about universal grammar. And then there's a second language and communication lecture that will cover speech act theory and sociolinguistics. Okay, so first of all, what is language? Well, obviously, it's a system of signs or symbols in which sounds or gestures stand for objects and ideas. These symbols are syntactic, which means that they're arranged into structures and patterns that partially determine their meaning. And one outcome of the syntactic nature of language is that it's infinitely generative. The amount of different things that I can say in English, or any other language for that matter, has no limit because I can arrange words in so many different ways. And I can invent new words or new ways to combine them. Language is learned, just like culture. If language was instinctive, then we would only have one language amongst all humankind, and everyone would learn to speak it, just like everyone learns how to walk and control their bladder. But that's not how language works. We learn the symbols, structure, and usage as children. And that means that languages are not static, they're always changing. So there's almost certainly some biological basis to human language. Take the example of Ildefonso, who's shown here with his American Sign Language teacher. Ildefonso is deaf, and he grew up in a small community where no one spoke sign language. So he didn't learn to speak until he was 27 years old, which was a pretty remarkable feat. But once he learned how to speak, Ildefonso was able to recount how he and his brother, who was also deaf, had invented a rudimentary language as children so that they could communicate with each other. So this anecdote illustrates both the importance of the learned component of language and also this biological component. We're compelled to communicate, and our brains are, to some extent, hardwired to facilitate the learning of language. But languages in all their complexity are created over the course of centuries by entire communities, not by individuals in one lifetime. Another really foundational question is, do other animals have language? And this is a topic that I've really been interested in for years, and I don't like Kotick's discussion of it in your textbook. His categorical statement that only humans have languages is only true if you believe that only human language counts as language. And this is what we call a tautology, or a circular argument. So many animals have complex communication systems. Kotick really only considers apes, and he only discusses cases where people have tried to teach captive apes human language. And they're not really that bad at learning it either, so some of the examples that he gives, chimps and gorillas in captivity have learned to communicate very effectively using sign language. They can talk about the past and future, they can use grammar, they can refer to objects and individuals that are not present, and they can even invent new words. Now, given that we're supposedly the only creatures with true language, or the most complex form of language, how much progress have we made in learning the languages of animals? I would say not much, but partly that's because we haven't been trying for very long. So here are a few examples of animals that are known to have really complex communication systems and or the ability to learn aspects of human language. And if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to pause the lecture and click on the link to a TED Talk about dolphin language, because this is a scientist who actually is going out and studying the way that dolphins communicate with each other and trying to learn to speak to them using their own language, rather than trying to get them to learn how to speak human language. Okay, so another important question is, when did human language begin in the form that we understand it today? I think we can all agree that there are some aspects of human language that are unique to humans. At the very least, we use language to discuss uniquely human problems. So, when did humans start speaking a language that you or I would be able to learn? Again, Kotick's discussion in your textbook is really bad for this topic. I encourage you to actually just disregard everything that he says. The short answer to this question is that we really don't know the answer. Some people have focused on the anatomy of the throat or fine motor skills in the mouth and tongue that are necessary for spoken language. But anyone who's ever met a sign language speaker knows that vocal anatomy is not necessary for human language. And Kotick talks a lot about this FOXP2 gene, which is definitely involved in brain development. And humans who have a mutation in this gene usually do have some speech problems. But the protein that this gene is responsible for creating is involved in switching on perhaps hundreds of different genes. So just because we need this gene to speak doesn't mean that it's the only gene controlling human language abilities. And unfortunately, although it makes a good story, the version of the origins of human language in the textbook is pretty much scientifically unfounded and it's much too simplistic. So this is just a little blurb from the Genetics Home Reference from the National Institutes of Health talking about some of what we know about FOXP2. So if you guys are interested in this, there's a lot of information online. All right, so we don't know exactly when humans started speaking languages that you or I could learn and understand, but it was probably a slow evolution from other forms of language that were used by our ancestors. And the Bible tells the story of the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis. And according to this story, in the years following the Great Flood, all humanity was united in a single speech community. And what this unified people did was they tried to build a tower that would reach heaven. And God was displeased with their hubris, and so he made their speech mutually unintelligible and scattered them across the world. Like a lot of ancient stories, I think there's a sound kind of historical hypothesis at the core of this tale, and it's one that many anthropologists still agree with, which is that at one point, humanity was small and local enough that everyone spoke the same language. And then as they spread out across the world and became more isolated, their speech gradually diverged and became mutually unintelligible languages. And I personally find that scenario pretty likely, but it's not necessarily true. It's also possible that people were using some more rudimentary form of communication, one that you or I wouldn't recognize as human language, when they first began to spread out across the globe. And in that scenario, modern human speech evolved several times independently, so then there would be several founding languages. And these stocks, these founding proto-languages are kind of unproven far back in the mists of time, but proposed relationships between lots of different language families. And one famous example is Amerindian, which is supposedly the language that was spoken by the first people to colonize the New World. So historical linguistics is the study of relationships between languages, trying to sort out which ones started out as the same language and when that original speech community existed. And this discipline is really old. It used to be called philology and has been around since medieval times. And one of its most famous practitioners was J.R.R. Tolkien, who was the author of The Lord of the Rings. So if any of you are fans like me, you'll know that Tolkien made up an entire language family as the backstory for the books. So this was just a nerdy hobby of his, but his day job was studying the evolution of the English language. And English has lots of different inputs from Celtic, Norse, and Germanic languages. Historic linguistics rests on some core principles. So first, there's this idea of a parent language, which is no longer spoken, but which has given rise to linguistic families that are historically known. And one of the more famous of these parent languages is Proto-Indo-European, which is this hypothetical ancient language that was spoken by the ancestors of all of the people who speak these various languages that you see on this slide. Living languages develop dialects, which eventually diverge and become mutually unintelligible, and then they're considered to be different languages. And there are accepted standards for determining which parts of a vocabulary are borrowed and which parts are ancestral, which I would love to get into because I'm kind of a nerd for this topic, but unfortunately they're pretty much beyond the scope of this class. So the relationships between some languages are obvious. If you've ever heard anyone speaking Dutch, you'll know that it's so similar to English that you feel like you're kind of teetering on the edge of comprehension. And that's because both English and Dutch are primarily Germanic languages. They're descended from the same parent language. But English has also had a lot of input from French, among other languages. And French is descended from Latin. And the inputs of French into English vocabulary came about because the French ruled England for several hundred years. So we can even tell a little bit about this political history, the fact that there were French kind of nobility ruling England, from the particular words that are borrowed from French. So the ruling class is speaking French, and the peasants and servants are still speaking the older form of English. So words for things that the ruling class did or used are often borrowed from French. The word mutton is a really good example of this. So in French, mouton means sheep, the animal. But in English, it's only used for the food or the dish, as in, bring me a plate of mutton, not for the animal. So the ruling class didn't order their servants to bring them a plate of sheep, and because of that, the Germanic word for the animal remained. Sheep comes from Old German. And we can still see languages diverging even today. It's not happening perhaps as intensely as it has at other points in history because the world is so interconnected right now. But dialects are still forming. So here's a few funny examples from the US. And another important sort of part of the evolution of languages is this idea of lexical borrowing. So lexical borrowing is when words are incorporated from one language into another without translation. And in English, there's tons of examples of this. We have words from French like cafe to mean a coffee shop or a little restaurant. Toboggan, which is taken from Native American Algonquin language to mean a particular type of sled. And often loanwords cluster around particular fields of activity in which the loaning group is dominant. So another example from English is that a lot of words related to philosophy come from Greek because a lot of the foundations of our philosophical tradition were invented by the Greeks. And loanwords can also cluster around items or parts of knowledge that have been passed from one group to another. So in English, a lot of our words for food come from Native American languages because a lot of those foods were domesticated by Native American communities and English speakers didn't find out about them until they came into contact with Native Americans. So examples of this are maize, squash, pecan, or pecan, depending on where you're from, chocolate, avocado, chili, tomato, tobacco. All of those words are Native American words. And another thing that we often borrow from Native American languages are words for natural features that only occur in the New World. So things like hurricane, mangrove, savanna, and bayou, these types of features that didn't exist in Europe and that were only encountered by English speakers when they were also coming into contact with Native Americans. So this concept of lexical borrowing is connected to another important term that Kotick reviews in your textbook, which is focal vocabulary. And a good way to remember what focal vocabulary means is to think about that cliche that Eskimos have hundreds of different words for snow. This isn't some idiosyncrasy of Arctic dwelling people. We all do this. So if I were to get talking shop with a bunch of archaeologists, chances are that a non-archaeologist will understand very little of what I say. Focal vocabularies and lexical borrowing often overlap. So scientists have a focal vocabulary that includes a lot more Latin words than normal English because the roots of scientific practice lie in the Enlightenment in Europe, where the language of educated people was Latin. So sometimes we call this jargon, and it's kind of a pejorative word, something that we're trying to eradicate from our vocabularies. But these specialized vocabularies are actually really important elements of culture, ways that we use to communicate really complex and esoteric things to other very knowledgeable people, and also ways that we mark ourselves as part of a group and exclude other people from our group or include them. When it comes to languages evolving and changing, some words are more resistant to borrowing than others. And this is what really helps us to reconstruct which languages are related to each other and which ones are not. So really basic vocabulary words like the words that we use for mother and father and child, for parts of our bodies, for numbers and colors and things like that, those tend not to be borrowed from other languages. So languages that are related to each other will have words that are really similar for these types of things. And then function words that express grammatical or structural relationships with other words in the sentence. So these are kind of the words that we don't think about much, like and but, or prepositions like of and at. Those tend not to change very much. And also what are called bound morphemes, which are not exactly words, but they're parts of words that change the meaning of the word. So like the affix which usually is... it has actually a lot of different meanings in English, but those types of pieces of language are very resistant to change as well. Okay, so we're living in a time when a lot of languages are going extinct. And what that means is that the oldest people who know how to speak those languages fluently are dying. And many languages are already gone, so they're only known from what was recorded about them before the last speaker died. And actually, linguistic anthropology, just like cultural anthropology, got its start in the US as a salvage operation. So scholars knew that many Native American languages were spoken by very few people, and they wanted to record and study the languages before they died out. The people at the Bureau of Ethnology, who we learned about in Lecture 1 of this unit, And later on, Boas and his students were very much part of this language recording effort. And at first, they just wanted to describe and classify languages and to figure out which ones were related using the methods of historical linguistics. But soon, they began to realize that something really important about language, something that made them even more anxious about language extinction, which is this concept of linguistic relativity. So what early linguistic anthropologists realized is that language shapes thought, and through thought, it shapes the nature of perceived reality. So I like to use Salvador Dali's painting The Dream to think about this idea. And in the dream, the dreamer's body is gone. So the dreamer is just a mass of thought that's connected to the world through these fragile crutches of perception. And since language structures thought, it also shapes reality by subtly altering the way that our minds are connected to the world around us. And this is what linguistic relativity means. It's the idea that speakers of different languages actually see the world differently. And this idea of linguistic relativity came out of the intellectual sort of heritage of Boas. So Boas had a student named Edward Sapir, and Sapir was really interested in languages, and particularly he was interested in Native American languages. So at the time, it wasn't accepted that all languages are equally complex. People were trying to rank languages just the same way they were trying to rank cultures. And Sapir argued that Native American languages were just as complex and complete as European ones, and that language and culture were sort of mutually constituting each other. And Sapir had a student named Benjamin Whorf who took his idea a step further and said that the structure of our native language actually conditions the pattern of our thought. So some concepts are going to be easily thought of by some speech communities, and those same concepts might be really difficult for the speakers of a different language to grasp. So the thoughts of these two guys put together are called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and there's 3 parts to it. So the first part is that structural differences between languages are going to be paralleled by cognitive differences. So what this means is basically just that languages are structuring thought. And the second part is that the structure of a person's native language strongly influences the worldview that he or she acquires. So this is that reality part. The way that you think shapes the way that you see reality. And the third part, which is the part that is kind of the most controversial or people have taken issue with, is that semantic systems of different languages vary with very few constraints. In other words, there are very big differences between languages and there are very few language constants. So languages are free to vary in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And what this leads to is a kind of extreme form of linguistic relativity where, at least hypothetically, you could have speakers of 2 different languages that really cannot understand each other at all, that have concepts that are untranslatable, completely untranslatable from one language to the other. Okay, so Whorf is a really interesting writer. He's one of my favorite writers, actually. And if you're interested in these ideas, I really recommend his book, Language, Thought, and Reality. He did a lot of field work with the Hopi, and so a lot of his theories are based on what he learned about their language. So the most controversial thing that Whorf said was that the Hopi did not have tenses in their language. That is, they had no explicit way to refer to whether something had happened in the past, present, or future. What he said is that instead, Hopi language, I should say, distinguish between manifested or unmanifest or manifesting. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. And this has been controversial because tenses were thought to be basically a linguistic universal, but further research has more or less borne out what Whorf said back then. A couple of other ethnographers have gone to work with the Hopi, have learned their language and analyzed it, and have sort of equivocally or unequivocally agreed with Whorf. So what he argued is that, right, instead of tenses, they have these ideas of manifest and unmanifest. And manifest is something that's accessible, something that you can see. It's part of the physical universe, either past or present. And unmanifest has been argued to be similar to the future tense in that it doesn't appear or exist at present. It only exists in the mind. It's hypothetical. But it can also be used to things that are behind or within physical objects, so the heart or the soul. And it's not advancing towards us as the future is in English, but it's already with us and sort of striving or hoping to become manifest. And that's why Whorf uses these terms instead of past and future. Okay, so that brings us to the idea of linguistic universals. And it's really surprising that it's pretty hard to find any. Even something as basic as tenses, there's exceptions of languages like Hopi that don't really have them. But nevertheless, there are some overarching things that all human languages have in common. And the biggest one is grammar. So grammar, sometimes called syntax, is the set of rules that govern how we put words together in a way that's intelligible. And this is one aspect of human language that makes it so versatile. So Noam Chomsky argued in the 1960s for something that he called universal grammar. And universal grammar is this idea that there's some structure in the brain that's hardwired to help us learn grammar, to help us learn the structure of language. And that's why it's so easy for children to learn languages. And Noam Chomsky's ideas about language and about a lot of other things have been really influential, but we have yet to find this structure in the brain. So there isn't like one area of the brain that's in control of speech. It's sort of all over the map. And so for someone like Noam Chomsky or his supporters sort of disagree with stronger versions of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So they don't think that language is free to vary. They think that many languages share a lot of aspects because they're biologically constrained by the way that our brain is structured. And this is a debate that continues right up until the present. Okay, so the next lecture is going to be about speech act theory and sociolinguistics, and that's it for Language and Communication Part 1.